Alrighty. Your Honor, members of the jury, opposing counsel, and may it please the court, make no mistake, this case today is not about the poor family you see over there at the plaintiff's table, who are victims of a crazy man who went into a brokerage firm, took many lives and then his own. It's not about other victims of gun violence either. This case, as the plaintiff's counsel has laid it out, is about a political pet project to destroy the manufacturers of guns because they think they know best. Now, the plaintiff's counsel just got up here and showed you a tragic video. A video of a son's last birthday with his father, who's no longer with us. I was moved. I was upset. I was enraged. And I imagine everyone in this courtroom and everyone across this country was as well. Well, then what did he say? He said that so long as gun violence allows, as long as guns are to be sold in America, gun violence will persist, and we'll have another tragic shooting tomorrow, and then another, and then another, and then another. And the only way to end the senseless violence is to make gun violence the gun manufacturer's problem. And then he concluded by promising you, the jury, that if you vote in favor of the plaintiff's case today, we will have fewer senseless deaths in America. Now, this is a negligence case. The theory of the legal claim brought by the plaintiffs in this case is that the manufacturer of the firearms, Vicksburg Gun Manufacturing Incorporated, was negligent in its sale and distribution of guns, and that somehow, because of their negligence, the plaintiffs suffered harm. But you notice how, throughout the entirety of the case, as soon as he played that tragic video for you, the plaintiffs went out of it. Now, for negligence, just really quickly, you need to show evidence that harm occurred to the plaintiffs. Not only that bad things happened, which we all believe was a tragedy, we're all enraged and we're all sympathetic to that cause. But to make the claim of negligence, the plaintiff's attorney has to show quantifiable damages by putting on evidence in this case to show the loss of companionship, the loss of consortium on behalf of the mother, the actual impact from a psychologist or from a medical doctor or from a sociologist or from anyone, the damage that this will have and affect Henry's life for the rest of his life, the loss of his father. We all agree that that's a harm that he will endure, but they put no evidence on, no expert, no testimony to show to the jury on the record what kind of harm was done, and therefore what kind of damages we can give them to make them whole. Because make no mistake, this is a negligence claim in civil court. This is for a monetary award. And I just think that it's kind of telling that the plaintiff's counsel left the family there behind in his closing argument, in his argument before you, as well as the way he ran his case. So now we kind of have that in mind, I want to talk about what we're going to go through in this closing argument. We're going to go through, first of all, the facts and the testimony as we heard them today. Following that, I'll talk about what the standard of law is that we need to apply to those facts. And then I'll show you at the end how, regardless of how we feel about the loss this poor family over here has suffered, there's only really one verdict we can return, no matter how we feel about the tragedy that occurred to them, and that's finding in favor of the defendants. All right. So, make sure here. All right. So very first today, we heard from Mr. Mike Murphy. Now, Mr. Mike Murphy is the sole proprietor and owner of the Excalibur gun shop in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Now, he is a federally licensed firearms dealer, which means that he holds a license from the federal government. In order for him to transact business to sell firearms to the public, he is required to maintain that license in every single transaction that he conducts in his business. Every pistol he sells, every rifle he sells, every upper receiver that's stamped, every lower receiver that's stamped has to be done through federal regulatory processes, which means a federal firearms form needs to be filled out by any individual seeking to purchase a firearm. It's filled out, it's verified for accuracy, it is sent in to the federal government's NICS system, which does a background check for any felonies, for matching the identification of the individual buying the firearm to that individual. So they have to pass a background check and fill out the proper forms. And only after that does Excalibur Firearms sell any gun to anybody seeking to purchase one from their location. Now, the gun that was purchased in this incident, right, was purchased by a man named Mike Kincaid. He was not a felon at that point in time. He passed his background check, and he was entitled to buy firearms and to possess them in the United States of America. So remember, we're talking about the sale of the firearm that was used in this tragic shooting. It was purchased legally from a licensed firearm dealer, and that licensed firearm dealer, Excalibur Arms, was investigated fully and found in full compliance with the federal law, not only in this transaction to Mr. Kincaid, but in every transaction that was looked at by the federal government. It still has an active federal firearms license and continues to do business to this day, properly and within the bounds of the law. Now, Mr. Kincaid, now, he took the guns that he purchased legally from Excalibur, and he sold them apparently out of the trunk of his car to unlicensed individuals. Now, Mr. Kincaid does not hold a federal firearms license. He did not have forms to do or background checks run. He sold to whoever. Now, Mr. Kincaid violated state and federal law when he did that. And guess what? He's been punished. He's done 5 years in federal prison for his illegal actions. But those actions were done by Mr. Kincaid, not by Excalibur Arms and not by Vicksburg Firearm Manufacturing Company. They were his individual action for which he has already been held accountable in a court of law and has already served or is serving his time that he got as a sentence for that illegal act. Now, he sold the guns to Mr. Peltier, or one gun to Mr. Peltier, who, tragically, a few days later, went into the brokerage firm, murdered 11 people, including the husband and father of this lovely family over here. He turned the gun on himself afterwards, and so, unfortunately, he's not here to face justice. He was not able to be brought to account and justice done for him. He took care of that himself. So again, we have two folks in this case who have committed criminally illegal acts. Mr. Kincaid, who sold guns to Mr. Peltier without having a federal firearms license, and Mr. Peltier and his entire was buying the gun illegally, and then his subsequent actions, which were among the most heinous things one could even imagine. All right. Next, we heard from the CEO of Vicksburg Firearms. And I'll admit, up on the stand with opposing counsel ragging him on, he flipped out. And you know what? He's kind of an asshole, and that's okay, because you don't have to like him. You don't have to like him as a person. You don't have to like the way he runs his business. But he runs his business legally. He manufactures firearms. And you might say, oh, well, he's a greedy bastard. Look, he's raking in the money. That might be true. We're not here to judge his economic status. We're not here to judge the amount of money he makes. We're not here to judge the efficacy of the product he makes. And we're not here to judge his character. So you don't have to like him. I don't have to like him. But that doesn't mean that his company was practicing negligence in the selling of firearms. All right. So now we need to go over actually what negligence means, because that was the last witness we had. Negligence legally is someone who is failing to exercise due care, the care a normal, ordinary person would show to another in the situation we're discussing, in the situation at hand. So basically, was Vicksburg Firearms somehow not showing the due care that a normal person would show another person in the way they manufactured and distributed their firearms. I guess marketed them as well. So what does that look like? Well, the opposing counsel never told you this or even ran through the negligence claim elements, but to have a negligence claim, you have to prove four things. First of all, you have to prove that there was a duty owed, that Vicksburg Firearms owed a duty of care to act in a certain way towards society. Second, you have to find that they breached that care. They did something outside the bounds of what a normal person would do in a similar situation. Three, you have to show a harm was caused, that someone suffered a harm, a concrete injury, an injury that proof was put on through evidence in this trial as to the nature of the injury, the extent of the injury, and its intractableness. And then you have to link that injury through causation, that this negligent breach by the defendant caused this specific harm. If you don't have that causation, that this breach caused this harm, then you don't have a negligence claim. Then you don't have anything you can award the plaintiff damages on. So let's go through that causation then. There are two kinds of causation you need to find a negligence claim. But for causation, which is if not for this breach you're claiming, that harm would not have happened. The second is proximate causation, which is that there is a reasonable uninterrupted nexus, uninterrupted chain of events that led from the breach of the duty by the defendant all the way through straight without any interruption to the harm that was caused. All right. Well, let's look at the first thing here, whether there was a duty of care owed by Vicksburg Firearms to the community as a whole. Vicksburg Firearms manufactures firearms and distributes them to licensed dealers. They do not sell them themselves. They don't have an ice cream truck with guns in it driving around the city, throwing them out of the windows. They manufacture firearms and they distribute them to licensed sellers. So what is their duty? What is the duty of care that Vicksburg Firearm owes the community? Well, first of all, to manufacture firearms that don't explode when you try to use them, to manufacture firearms that function properly and don't hurt the user. That would be a breach of their care. That's not alleged here, and that doesn't happen. The second thing is in their distribution and marketing of them. Well, the federal government kind of steps in here and says, firearm manufacturers, you can only distribute your firearms to dealers that the federal government has inspected themselves and licensed and found to be in full compliance with all federal regulation and all alcohol, tobacco, and firearms regulation. That is how you can distribute firearms. That's the only way. So were they using the standard of care in that distribution that a normal, similarly situated individual would use when doing that? Well, they didn't violate any federal laws. They manufactured their weapons and they distributed them only to licensed dealers. So if their duty of care is to follow all the federal regulations and laws that the government has put in place regulating firearm sales and manufacture, well, they've done that. And there's been no evidence put on that they owed an additional duty to anyone other than the federal government by distributing and manufacturing their product. All right. But even if, for some reason, there's some theory that the plaintiffs have not put on that shows that they owed some additional duty in addition to what the federal government and state regulations make them have, the causation is a huge issue. Even if you find for some reason them even making guns at all was negligent, right? Or them giving the guns to a licensed dealer was negligent. There's still intervening acts that happen that break that causation. You need an unbroken chain of this causes harm. You have the illegal sale of the firearm to Mr. Peltier from a third party that Vicksburg Firearms has no control over. He's not their boss. I mean, they're not his boss. They're not his agent. He's not their spouse. He's not their employee. He's a third party, a man on the street who bought a gun legally from a licensed dealer and then sold it to Mr. Peltier. And then you have Mr. Peltier's criminal actions, which have already been found. Well, not been found. He's no longer here, but he would have been found, obviously, murderous on multiple counts. And you found Mr. Kincaid was prosecuted and served time in federal prison for his illegal actions. Both of those actions are independent of Vicksburg Firearms, and both of those actions break the chain of proximate causation. meaning that even if you suppose you like hocus pocus a duty out of somewhere for Vicksburg firearms, it cannot be seen to cause the harm because the chain of proximate causation was broken. And the plaintiffs put no evidence on about this. They put no proof. They didn't even discuss the elements of negligence. Why? Because they don't want you to look at the law. They want you to use emotion. They want you to make a boogeyman out of Vicksburg firearms. In the closing arguments, the opposing counsel said that Vicksburg firearms is complicit in the murder of this woman's husband and this son's father. This is not a murder trial. This is not a criminal trial. This is a trial about negligence. Complicity in a murder equals an intention or a lack of care about something going on. They knew it was going on. They were part of it. They stand by and just watched it happen. That's an emotional argument. And it's an argument that has no bearing in the court of law today and has no bearing in the facts of this case. All right. So the real argument that's going on here today, the real attempt of the plaintiffs, has nothing to do with this lovely family at the table over here. It has to do with an attempt by the plaintiff's counsel to get you to ignore the law, to forget the judicial standards, the due process, the burden of proof, to get you to act so far beyond the bounds of the law that they don't even mention the standards or the legal claims in their case. They say they want to trick you. They want to get you to issue a verdict awarding this woman and her son damages. Because you know this lawyer, the other counsel here, as soon as this goes through and the jury finds this is possible, has 5,000 other lawsuits ready to go against every gun manufacturer in this country for every person who's ever been hurt by a gun in America. Why? Because it's not about recovering damages or making this woman and this child whole again. It's about a political agenda to get rid of guns in America. He said it himself at the end of his closing argument. He said that until we make gun violence the gun manufacturer's problem, there will be more senseless deaths in America, and told you, the jury, that you can end this violence today by returning a verdict. He doesn't care about the return of money, of making his clients whole. He cares about ending gun violence. That's the charge he put on you, not to make this woman and her child monetarily whole again for the loss of their companionship, their father, and of their husband. No, he wants you to take it out on the gun manufacturers because they're evil. He wants to use you to do something that even the Congress of the United States or the state of Louisiana will not do. He wants to use you, and by using you, using that family over there as a political pawn to get an agenda across. But let me tell you, even if you believe that senseless violence should be stopped in America and that gun violence is too bad and there's too many bad people using guns, even if you believe that, there's something else you need to consider. In America today, there are, admittedly, 21,000 annual deaths caused by firearms. That's insane. That's way too many. But if you think it's a good idea to restrict Americans' access to guns to save those 21,000 lives, you need to also be aware that last year, there were 1.6 million defensive uses of firearms in America by lawful gun holders. Now, a defensive use of a firearm is when somebody, usually a vulnerable person, say a woman, an old lady, a college student in their apartment, uses a firearm either by discharging it or also just by pulling out and brandishing it, or by the criminal being aware that there's a weapon in the house that stops the criminal activity from occurring. In some instances, it stops sexual assaults from a smaller woman and a larger man who's getting, aggressive. The access to a firearm, even as just a display, allows those innocent people to defend themselves from actual crimes. And it happens 1.6 million times a year in America, according to the CDC's own data. So if you think that somehow getting rid of access to firearms is going to alleviate the violence, protect the most vulnerable, you would be mistaken. All the times that no one dies in the defensive use of a firearm. When the gun is pulled out and the criminal runs away, or just the mere threat of the firearm makes the crime stop. That's the harm that, even if you believe this policy argument the plaintiff's counsel is making, that's the harm you'll be inflicting on society today. So in closing, I think we just need to say, the case today you've been asked to return a verdict on is a civil claim of negligence. Nothing more, nothing less. To find a claim of negligence, you have to see that the defendant acted in a way that breached his duty of care, which is the way a normal human being would act in care for another in this particular circumstance. 2, that breach caused a harm that's been quantifiable and evidence has put on to prove its existence, its extent, and the monetary award that you should give for that harm to the plaintiff, and that hasn't happened. And 3, that was a direct and proximate cause of the harm. The breach was a proximate cause of the harm. Well, there's been no duty of care established we've been through. The federal law has been followed, all regulations abided by. The injury that is alleged wasn't even attested to by anyone in court. No expert witnesses about damages, no actual evidence put on about what harm this caused this family. And even if there was, we can say this family is obviously harmed. Look at them. They've lost their father and their husband. There's harm here. We can't even discuss that because the plaintiffs failed to put evidence on discussing it or bringing it into the record or saying how much it is or how much we should give it or what factors we should consider in distinguishing this harm. The plaintiffs have failed to put on a shred of evidence about that. So we can't, even if we want to, go forward with that claim. Again, that's the elements of negligence. And even if you want to just hocus pocus those two into existence, the final one, the proximate cause, that this, without any breaks in the chain, caused the harm. The illegal sale of the gun to Mr. Peltier and then Mr. Peltier's independent actions, both criminal in nature, break the chain of causation. So even if you want to hocus pocus elements of negligence here, there's no way, unless you decide to go against the law and go against regulation, that you could possibly find for the plaintiff today. Because they failed to meet their burden, I would urge a vote for the defendant in this case. Thank you.